Although DeAndre Hopkins has been fairly underwhelming so far this year, he actually is going to be our first must start for this week. He's going to be playing a Colts secondary that has been so bad. And again, we would know. We have watched this firsthand. They have the 24th ranked passing defense in the league right now, according to PFF. You're talking about a defense that was bad before, but just lost their starting cornerback, Dallas Flowers, who was their second cornerback behind Kenny Moore. Just lost him to an Achilles injury for the entire season. Now, I think their best option is going to be to have Juju Brinson there, who is a rookie cornerback, second-round pick. Yes, he has promise, but we still are not going to be trusting any of these Indianapolis cornerbacks against receivers, so it's going to make DeAndre Hopkins a guy that we're going to want to start this week. When you look at lead wide receivers against Indianapolis through 4 weeks, you're talking about Calvin Ridley with 24 points, Nico Collins with 27, Tank Dell with 20, Zay Flowers with 13, Puka Nacua last week with 31 points. You could literally, honestly, make an argument to start Treylon Burks this week. I mean, that's how bad the Colts secondary is, and you're seeing it from a fantasy production perspective. Every time you have these wide receivers go up against this Colts defense, they are producing at a high fantasy clip. So for DeAndre Hopkins, we are going to start him because he is the lead wide receiver, and from here on out, and you're going to hear it on our videos because we're going to consistently, unless there's somebody we don't believe in, we're going to consistently start the lead wide receiver in an offense playing the Colts every single week. And this week, that is DeAndre Hopkins, even with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback, even though it doesn't look super good so far. DeAndre Hopkins, he's a must start for us this week for sure.
Yeah, and even when you're looking at his volume in general, I know it's kind of looking terrible from a fantasy perspective for those receiving assets in Tennessee, but he still, over the last few weeks, has gotten 13 targets in week 1, 5, 7, 6, and that's respectable enough that he should be started. I mean, if he's getting that volume against the Colts, remember, Puka Nacua is in overtime, just left wide open for the game-winning touchdown. That's the story of the Colts secondary. That's the story of any horrible secondary currently in the NFL with talented wide receivers, and DeAndre Hopkins is one of those. He's going to have a really good week.
Yeah.
Next guy we're going to have here is Terry McLaurin, and this is the same story. Terry McLaurin, a very talented, a very, very good wide receiver in the NFL for the Washington Commanders, playing with Sam Howell, playing alongside Jahan Dotson and Curtis Samuel, who all three of them produced last week against a just kidding, not a horrible defense, a good defense in the Philadelphia Eagles. And this week they are playing a horrible defense in the Chicago Bears. And when you're looking at what Terry McLaurin did in week 2, you're like, okay, well, yeah, this was a division rival game. Maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it was just Washington, doing what they do against the Eagles, which is, usually make it a game. Well, what did Terry do against other bad defenses? I can't even believe we're doing this at this point, but we have to with Terry. He played Denver in week 2. He put up 16 points on 6 targets, 5 receptions, 54 yards, and a touchdown. You just basically take that, copy and paste it, put it in week 5, and hopefully add a little more production, a little more target volume as well, because he is on the rise from that perspective as well. I think you got to be looking at Terry very excited, and he is a must start, especially with a lot of receiving weapons this week being out due to the bye.
And I think the biggest X factor here that we need to talk about is Sam Howell, because as you saw Sam Howell play better last week, those receivers were able to get not only the volume, but the level of quarterback play that is required to support those guys. I mean, earlier in the season, one of our videos, we said, we can't start Terry McLaurin. We can't start Jahan Dotson because we just aren't sure about Sam Howell. Now he comes out, he throws the ball at a very high rate, and he has a very high success rate as well. They almost took down the Philadelphia Eagles. I will tell you this, if Sam Howell continues to play like he did last week, and he continues to be able to get the ball in his receivers' hands, I mean, he had 10 targets last week compared to the 6 he had in the first 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I'm going to feel a lot more comfortable starting Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson from here on out. Jahan Dotson, maybe he's not dead. Who knows? But it's been concerning so far, and this is a little bit of a better sign for these guys. Yeah. I mean, when you're thinking about it from a fantasy perspective. Next on this list is going to be Garrett Wilson, who's playing the Denver Broncos. At this point in the season, guys, we are targeting these defenses that we know are giving up high-volume fantasy producing wide receiver ones. And when you're talking about the Denver Broncos defense, you're talking about the worst-graded PFF defense in the past 4 years in their database. 4. This is a defense, and this should say enough to you people, that Justin Fields threw 4 touchdowns against. If Justin Fields can throw 4 touchdowns against you, at that point, I'm willing to start the 5th string wide receiver on the team that plays them next week. But we're going to go with the lead wide receiver. We're going to go with Garrett Wilson. Again, PFF coverage grade dead last. Wilson won't live up to where he was being drafted in fantasy this offseason. That's out the window. And there have even been times where we've looked at Garrett Wilson and been like, you can't start Garrett Wilson, like against the New England Patriots. Like, that was a week you knew he was going to get shut down. Even against the Cowboys, he had the one play, but outside of that, he got shut down. Zach Wilson, this is interesting, has not destroyed his relevancy. When you're looking at versus Dallas, he had 16 points. Versus New England, he did have 9.8 points still. And then Kansas City, last week, he had 15 points. He had 14. I'll say that again. 14 targets, 9 receptions, 60 yards. And again, so the average depth of target, the average depth of reception, not going to be super long at all, but that's actually not a bad thing. I mean, you look at guys like Chris Godwin, guys like Michael Pittman, and they have these shorter ADOTs, and they have proven to be quarterback proof. Both of those guys have. And they're getting a lot of targets, even though they're short distance targets. But when you're playing in full point PPR leagues or even half point PPR leagues, these are the points that matters. So we told you to be patient with Garrett Wilson. Be weary of shipping him off for a bucket of shells. This is exactly why. He's proven over the last couple of weeks he can still drop 15 points. He's a viable starting option. This week, he's playing one of the worst defenses in the league. We're going to expect a big game for Garrett Wilson this week.
Yeah, and another big game for Zach Wilson, which I can't even believe we're saying at this point, but there was actually some sign of life. I thought this would be the week where Wilson was benched mid-game and that his career would be over for good, and he went out there and he actually looked, instead of looking like the worst quarterback in the NFL, he looked like a bottom half quarterback in the NFL.
Which is really impressive.
Which is honestly as bad as he's been. That was very impressive and good for the fantasy assets there as well. Breece Hall, we're going to stay in this game. We're going to stay on the same team. Again, Denver Broncos offense. Look at what Khalil Herbert did, a much less talented running back for the Chicago Bears, putting up 22 points on top of DJ Moore's 27, on top of Cole Kmet's 27, on top of Justin Fields throwing 4 passing touchdowns. Khalil Herbert, very, very efficient, looked very, very good. Anyone is going to look good against the Denver Broncos defense. This is the story of the video, guys. The story of the video. Breece Hall has been limited through the first 4 weeks of the year, but he has flashed. If you have watched the Jets games, if you have watched Breece Hall, every time he touches the ball, you're worried that he's going to break it away for a 15-yard gain or more. Of all the weeks for Breece to take off, guys, you can bet on this week being that time when he finally is a startable asset.
Yeah, he's getting up to close to 50% snap share now, which you like to see. He only had 6 rushing attempts last week. However, he did have 56 yards, which is 9 yards per carry. What you really like to see from Breece Hall, what is really promising from here going on out, is that he had 4 targets and he had 3 receptions. So although he only had 9.9 points last week, and we haven't really seen the 80-yard runs back to back like we did in week 1, Breece Hall is going to start to get his footing under him, and he is starting to get more snap share now, and that's very good as well. Joe Mixon is going to be next. We're going to put Joe Mixon back on this list. We had Joe Mixon on here once, and I don't think he did very well. But again, with Joe Mixon, he's the RB20 right now. Running backs against Arizona in the first 4 weeks of the season. Let's look at this. Brian Robinson had 13 points. Saquon Barkley had 27 points. Tony Pollard had 15 points. And Christian McCaffrey just put up 48 points against this Arizona Cardinals run defense. Mixon, honestly, he has a pretty safe floor as it is. I mean, take into account the success that these running backs have had, and you have a great starting option for week 5. Joe Mixon is almost a start every single week, but he's also a guy, when you're looking at his snap share, 79%, 75%, 78%, a guy that's getting the workhorse majority of snaps. And when you're having those guys right now in fantasy football, you have to start them regardless. You're going to have to start them every week regardless of who's on your bench. And Joe Mixon, even though the offense hasn't been there, even though they did not start clicking last week, even though Joe Burrow does not look good, when you combine the matchup with the situation, with the fact that he's getting the volume that he needs to produce as a high-scoring fantasy asset, we're going to be comfortable starting Joe Mixon this week versus the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, and to me, it's the volume. You cannot turn down this volume every single week. And even though you've started him every single week, and he's been 13, 14 points in weeks 2 and 3, which was fine, and then had only 8 points in week 4, like this is, again, just something that you can't turn down when you're like, should I start or sit Joe Mixon? Just keep starting him. At some point, he's going to get to the point where he's turning this into larger quantities of fantasy points every single week.
Yep.
Next guy we're going to have here is Zay Flowers going against Pittsburgh. And I know at face value, that's like, hey, you're playing Pittsburgh. That's a little concerning. But this is interesting. When you look at wide receivers against Pittsburgh's defense over the first 4 weeks of the season, Brandon Ayuk in week 1, 32 points. Amari Cooper, a division rival rival game. Keep that in mind, 16 points, where he was also banged up in that game as well. Devontae Adams putting up 42 and Nico Collins with 35. Yes, I know Mark Andrews has found his own in that offense with his volume, but he only had 5 targets last week. He was just able to turn that into 25 points. And since 2019, Mark Andrews has averaged only 10.5 points per game against Pittsburgh, with some very disappointing performances like a floor of 3 points, 6 points. He has laid some duds in those games in the past. I think, again, this is a situation where it's like there's a lot of teams out there that are going to be looking to their depth because there are so many receivers that are on bye this week that you are consistently starting every single week when they're healthy and when they're not on bye. And you're going to come to a point where you're looking at Zay Flowers, you're like, man, he's the last guy I have left, or the second to last guy. I'm debating between him and someone else. I would lean Zay Flowers. I would pick Zay Flowers because he does have that upside. He does have that ability based off of what Pittsburgh's secondary has allowed in fantasy this season.
Even looking at Zay Flowers' floor, which was last week in my opinion, he had 98% snap share, only had 4 targets, still had 8 points.
Yeah.
And people have been saying, oh yeah, Zay Flowers, they're only giving the ball down the line of scrimmage and he's a gadget guy and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, he had, 19 yards per catch in his last game? He's proved this is not. This is not true for Zay Flowers. He with the floor that he offers now, he's going to be a must start most weeks, but especially against the Pittsburgh Steelers this week, we're going to be comfortable starting him for sure. Nico Collins is going to be next on this list. We talked very highly about Nico Collins a couple weeks ago, especially in connection with Tank Dell. That did not turn out very well for us. However, looking at Nico Collins, he's going to be playing the Atlanta Falcons pass defense, which is 26th in the league in pass rush. So that's the pass rush. I'm not sure what the coverage defense or the coverage grade is, but when you look at what he's doing, CJ Stroud, especially CJ Stroud, with pretty much a practice squad offensive line. Next week, he's going to be facing the Falcons, like I said, with a bad defense. And Nico's really been a beast as it is. His career stat lines in 2021, 33 catches, 446 yards and a touchdown. In 2022, 37 catches, 481 yards and 2 touchdowns. And in 2023 alone, already so far, 22 catches for 428 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he has more touchdowns this year than he did in either of the previous seasons. He's going to pass his yardage total in this week or the next one, and his receptions total in this week or the next one. You're talking about a guy that's playing at such a high level right now with such a high level quarterback that you are going to start to you're going to have to start him, in my opinion. That's what good quarterback does for wide receivers. Expect more of the same from Nico Collins for the rest of the season. He's a good rest of the season buy, in my opinion. And I would expect him to come out and have a strong game against Atlanta in their defense.
Yeah, and we're going to close out this video here with Rashee Rice playing against the Minnesota Vikings. And I know this is a little bit risky. I understand that. But again, you've got to think of the situation here. You've got to look beyond Rashee Rice being a little bit iffy to start the year. One, he's a rookie, and he's gotten more consistent volume as the weeks have progressed. And you've seen an uptick in usage. He has done pretty well. He did all right against the Jets, I believe, and the Vikings secondary especially. This is really my point here, is they've allowed the following receivers to produce against them. Keenan Allen, 45 points. Mike Williams, 25. Josh Palmer, 14. That was all in the same game. Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, 18 and 10 points. Adam Thielen and Terrace Marshall, 15 and 14 points. Some of these receivers are mid. Josh Palmer, Terrace Marshall, Adam Thielen, those guys are mid. Devonta Smith is not mid. He put up 23 points. But regardless, I think you have to be looking at this situation saying, Rashee Rice, I know it's really hard to predict these wide receivers in Kansas City, but Rashee Rice compared to Kadarius Toney, compared to Marquez Valdes-Scantling, compared to Sky Moore, he has had the most consistent volume on a weekly basis. And I think you're looking at Minnesota. They're obviously going to take all their best guys and they're all going to focus on Travis Kelce, because that's what you do when you play the Kansas City Chiefs if you're smart. That leaves Rashee Rice. We've already seen Rashee Rice get some nice red zone targets as well. That's how he scored and got a touchdown in the first game of his career. I'm counting on that again this week. If you have to start Rashee Rice, I think you're feeling decently comfortable with that.
All right, that's going to wrap up our must starts for this week. These are guys that we are personally starting. So again, the disclaimer is if you feel like starting somebody else and your gut says to do that, do so. I would not recommend following every single thing a fantasy analyst tells you, because if you end up doing that, you are going to miss. And there's not a single fantasy analyst out there that gets everything right and wins every single league. So again, these are just guys we are starting, and we would recommend that you do as well. Do us a huge favor. Make sure you drop a like on this video. That helps us out a ton. And make sure you subscribe to the channel. Head over to flockfantasy.com/domain for our rankings for the rest of the season and all of our exclusive content. Appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you later.